listening to Unlimited Hangout. I'm your host, Whitney Webb. Today we are going to be wading into the big story in the financial world, and more specifically the crypto space, by working to make sense of the spectacular implosion of FTX and the mystique behind its 30-year-old billionaire founder, Sam Bankman-Fried. With each passing day, the news about the story gets progressively more insane, with the obvious fraudulent behavior of Bankman-Fried and his polycule posse becoming ever more apparent. Yet some major outlets like the New York Times, in covering the FTX collapse, have avoided portraying Bankman-Fried as a criminal or fraud. They haven't even bothered to call out what he was actually doing at FTX, which is more or less running a massive Ponzi scheme. Yet, beyond the brazen criminality, the story has taken on some interesting new dimensions following revelations about Sam Bankman-Fried's connections, particularly those of his family and his ties to a bizarre, somewhat cultish movement of self-styled philanthropists known as effective altruism. Not only that, but some of these connections involve cozy ties to those leading the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as a revolving door between congressional staff and one of FTX's subsidiaries. Did Sam Bankman-Fried really accomplish all of this on his own? No, but the narrative is quickly being spun that he conducted all of this fraud, avoided regulatory scrutiny, and amassed billions of dollars of wealth without the help of a network that benefited from and protected his activities. Such a narrative is oddly reminiscent of the mainstream narrative about another brazen financial criminal, Jeffrey Epstein. To help me make sense of this complete hive of financial fuckery and apparent conspiracy, I am joined today by Marty Bent and Mike Krieger. Marty is the founder of TFTC.io, a media company focused on Bitcoin, beauty, and freedom in the digital age. He is also a partner at 1031, a leading investment platform focused exclusively on investing in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and he hosts the Tales from the Crypt, or TFTC, podcast. Mike formerly worked on Wall Street as an oil and gas general commodities analyst and equity research, and later on a trading desk. He ultimately left in disgust over the state of the industry, can't blame him, and started the website Liberty Blitzkrieg. Though he doesn't blog much anymore, Mike still shares his insights on social media and elsewhere in between homeschooling his 4 kids and gardening. So, hey guys, thanks for being here today. Welcome to Unlimited Hangout.
Hey, Whitney, great to be here. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, Whitney.
Well, thanks so much for being here, because we have a lot to get into. So I'm sure by now most people are familiar, or at least have heard of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, since it's been in the news so much over the past several days. But maybe we should start off giving a summary of the collapse, exactly how it happened, what was the lead up to it, and what was FTX, and what did it claim to be doing versus what it was actually doing.
Yes, I guess I can take that, and we'll start with. I guess we have to start with what was FTX. How did it start? In short, FTX was a cryptocurrency exchange where people could deposit Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies and trade those currencies against each other, and then trade them with leverage as well. So this was a spot where many individuals and hedge funds in the crypto space would come to trade different altcoins and Bitcoin using leverage to try to make a return. But FTX spun out of a trading research firm known as Alameda, and Alameda, their claim to fame was their ability to arbitrage the price of Bitcoin across Western and Asian markets in around 2018, 2019. I mean, the origin story and the lore behind Alameda that SPF would put out there was that they were somehow able to recognize that Bitcoin was trading at, say, $10,000 in the US and $10,100 in Japan. And apparently they were able to spin up a bunch of bank accounts across the world and arbitrage that price difference. So they would buy Bitcoin for $10,000 in the US and then sell it for $10,100 in Japan immediately. And they claim to have been wildly profitable with that particular trade. And they brought it over to South Korea too. At least that's the story. I'm not sure.
Do you buy that story? Because I've heard from people that talked about that we're talking about FTX being fraudulent, basically. In October, I think Mark Cajodes or something like that is his name, and he was saying that this origin story doesn't make any sense to him at all. He would have had to have a ton of capital that wasn't his behind him to have made this strategy work.
Yes, I'm a bit skeptical about it too, and I bet Michael could chime in here about the nature of the type of infrastructure that would have to be set up from multiple bank accounts across the world to actually make this trade possible in the first place.
Yeah. So to just chime in, a few things to add there. One is that there were some chat releases or messages recently. I don't know if you two saw, but from ex former employees talking about how they did make a decent amount of money on that trade somehow. We can get into that the details later and how the effective altruism network apparently made all that happen. But these employees claim that it was squandered, that whatever money they made was squandered. So you're still left with this gaping hole of where did all of that initial money come from to launch FTX? And remember that FTX didn't just, sort of launch, out of a basement or a garage and then slowly, gain share. It came out of nowhere, and we still don't know, really the origin of the money where it came from, and it absolutely exploded. I believe that it started only a few days after Biden announced his presidential candidacy. So sometime in 2019, then. But it just came out of nowhere, and it very quickly became one of the biggest. So that's bizarre. The one I think, Whitney, we've I know you've done so much work on Epstein, but when you first look at him, right, one of the you're looking for the money, sort of where did
Yeah.
the initial kind of big money or sort of injection come from. I think Wexner was one of the first. Correct me if I'm wrong. In this case, it seems like the only name that I can attach to money early on was this guy Jan Tallinn, who's a co-founder of Skype and also an effective altruist. So that's sort of
Mhm.
the first. That's the only significant chunk of money that I've been able to find that surfaces kind of early on in the origin story. It was from that individual.
Yeah, so we'll get in the effective altruist stuff a bit later because that's a real hive to explain because there's a lot of backstory to that. But I guess to sum it up briefly here, it seems like a lot of FTX's initial activities and really Sam Bankman-Fried's career from the time he left MIT on was effectively managed by this particular group of effective altruists, which is really quite a tight knit network. And again, we'll get into that later. So origin story aside, so we've talked a little bit about, I guess, what FTX was. So a lot has come out, especially last week, about what they were actually doing, or rather, what they were supposed to be doing but didn't do. So maybe we could go over that a little bit in terms of just the evidence of excessive fraud and like what has been exposed about FTX that's significant on the business side.
Yeah, and this dovetails into the thread that was pulled on over the last couple of weeks that essentially uncovered the big massive fraud that was going on. And this revolves around FTX's exchange token FTT. So when uh, so first we'll say there's this big theme in the overarching cryptocurrency space, particularly with exchanges, where they'll essentially launch their own token exchange token, and they market that this token will allow users to benefit from the profitability of the exchange. In my mind, this whole token mechanism doesn't make sense from first principles, but it has been a trend over the last 5 to 6 years, particular. But Binance has an exchange token, crypto.com has an exchange token, and FTX had an exchange token as well. And so this is where the unraveling of FTX began. So they had their FTT token, and the way that these token mechanics typically work is the exchange will pre-mine a bunch of these exchange tokens, in FTX's case, FTT. And what they'll do is they'll hold a lion's share of the supply off the market on their own balance sheet, and then they'll release a small fraction of the free float of the token to retail investors, and they can trade that. And what this mechanism allows, since they're holding a lot of supply off the market, it allows them to artificially increase the price of these tokens rather trivially with some wash trading. And so in the case of FTX and FTT, many people believe what they were doing was wash trading via Alameda to push the price of FTT up significantly high, giving it a lot of value in a larger market cap, an artificial market cap, if you will. And so what happened a few weeks ago was CoinDesk released an article of FTX's balance sheet, and it basically highlighted that a lion's share of FTX's balance sheet was their own FTT token and not actually Bitcoin, or other more established cryptocurrencies. And what happened then is that their largest competitor in the space, Binance, their CEO recognized this and basically saw it as an opportunity to take out a competitor, or he simply saw this is insane that their balance sheet is predominantly their own exchange token, and not they don't have a significant amount of Bitcoin or cash on their balance sheet. And so what happened after CZ, the CEO of Binance, saw that balance sheet in the CoinDesk article, he came out publicly and announced, we're not comfortable with the state of FTX, so we're going to dump our FTT tokens. Binance had upwards of $500 million worth of this FTT token. So when CZ came out and publicly signaled that Binance was going to dump their FTT tokens, the price of FTT started to fall significantly because others saw that, and Binance being one of the largest holders, that they're going to sell their FTT tokens. That means the price is going to go down. And so others who did not want to get taken out with the tide of that trade decided to follow along with CZ. And so that drove the price of FTT token down below what many are claiming to be a critical point, which was $22. Eventually, it fell down to, I believe, $4. But when that happened, when CZ started selling and others started selling as well, the price of FTT fell significantly, obviously. And this is what began the unraveling of the giant fraud that was FTX. And so once the price fell below a critical point, the market became aware that what FTX was doing is they were giving large amounts of FTT to Alameda, their trading arm, which are supposed to be separate. I think that should be important to note is FTX and Alameda were posturing publicly that they were completely separate entities that had no involvement with each other, but it's become glaringly obvious that they were commingling funds and working very closely with each other. And so when the price of FTT fell, it became known that FTX was giving a bunch of FTT tokens to Alameda, and then Alameda was using those FTT tokens as collateral to take out loans from many other actors in the space, loans in Bitcoin and stable coins. And so when the price fell, the collateral with all the loans that Alameda had taken out became essentially worthless, and they became the debt that they had taken out, they couldn't pay it back. And so they became essentially insolvent overnight. And that's where the cascading effect began.
So in the aftermath of this and them filing for bankruptcy, a guy has been put in charge of FTX. And most of the people that had previously been in charge of it, including Bankman-Fried, of course, are out at this point. But this guy, John Ray, right? He was previously brought in to clean up Enron, and he had a bunch of revelations. I guess that he produced in a court filing or elsewhere. Some sort of documentation came out where he was basically going over that this is even worse than Enron in terms of corporate controls, and some of the stuff he said was just insane. Like they didn't even have a bank account, and like I mean, loads of stuff that's really just mind-boggling. Do you guys want to go over that for a little bit?
Well, I wanted to just add some clarification on what Marty was saying as well, because some people listening may get really confused as far as, FTT, how could it possibly, sort of collateralize this gigantic Ponzi scheme? And, what is it even, right? From what from my reading, and maybe, and Marty can correct me if I'm wrong here, because I've never traded or had any funds on FTX, but I read that apparently FTX was offering discounts on their on trading or something like that to customers or users that were using the FTT or holding the FTT token. So that might have been the carrot that was being used, because remember, these tokens are not equity, right? It's not an equity stake in FTX. There's no like ownership of anything that comes along with holding a token. So they have to put out some sort of rationale for what is this going to do, and I think that's what it was. Are you aware of anything like that, Marty, or does that sound right?
Yeah, and to be clear, I've never traded on FTX or used FTT token, but yeah, that's typically how these exchange tokens work. They try to basically give benefits to users of that token on the exchange that others who aren't using the token would not get.
Right. And so again, that's sort of a way to tie some sort of utility to it, to then that's how that's one of the ways that the value can get just crazily inflated, because users might just choose to hold that token on the exchange, because there's some marginal value to it, some discount or something like that.
Yes, yes. And that's actually, I believe, how FTX originally launched. I believe the FTT token was part of an ICO that they launched to actually fund or market that they were funding the exchange with the FTT ICO.
Right. So for people that don't know, that's ICO is initial coin offering. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if everyone's up to speed on crypto that listens to my podcast. I'm certainly not, a crypto person myself in terms of being as knowledgeable as you guys about this type of stuff, which is, part of why you are here. So anyway, to get back to the conversation, about FTX, and so we can spend more time sort of unpacking a lot of these, revelations that aren't getting a lot of lip service in the media, about this whole situation. Returning to what I mentioned a minute ago about the extent of criminality and fraud, and how the person that's been previously brought in to clean up Enron, says it's the worst thing he's ever seen in his whole career. There was no board meetings, like I mentioned earlier, no bank account. So I mean, if it was this egregious, how and why was nothing done before its collapse?
Well, I mean, I'll take this just to start. I think Marty actually called out SBF publicly on Twitter earlier a few times. I think I recall that. I never did, but I've also been very much not paying as close attention to a lot of different things over the last year or so. I've been much less active than I was historically. However, I do recall, earlier this year, when I saw him on stage with Clinton and Tony Blair at, I believe it was the
It's
Bahamas.
usually a telling thing.
Right. But I saw this guy, and then also when I just saw him sort of disparaging Bitcoin, very in what I thought to be a very snake-like fashion, very publicly calling for regulations. I mean, even someone like me who's not paying that close attention, that definitely made sort of caused me to say, wait a minute. First of all, where did this guy come from? Who is this guy? What is he doing? It felt to me like it was some sort of a op. Or he was somebody's, beard or something, that he was there for some purpose. And I just didn't bother to look into it at all. I had no stake in any of this, right? But it was always weird to me, like, because the talking points that he was using, it was almost as if I was the WEF and I wanted to, wreck Bitcoin as much as possible, I'd be this guy, I just create this guy in a laboratory and put him out there. So that to me was always super bizarre. And I think that in some way must tie into the question you're asking, which is, how was this allowed to get so big so fast and go on? And I think the clear answer to that, at least from my perspective, based on what I'm seeing, is that it was an intentional thing. He was meant to push forward some sort of quote unquote elite narrative and agenda. I think that much is clear, and obviously even more clear now that we can unpack a lot of these weird connections and webs that we will do. But that's my take. And I sort of had that feeling from when I first saw him, but now it's just becoming too obvious.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Marty, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I just echo what Michael said. I mean, Michael mentioned I've been calling SBF out since July of last year, 2021. And again, I haven't been, I focus on Bitcoin only. I really don't trade any of the other cryptocurrencies and had no use for FTX at all or my involvement in Bitcoin. But I would echo what Michael just said. Like the reason I started calling him out in July of last year is because he was going on CNBC and being vaunted as this expert that knew everything about the space. And there was one particular interview he conducted with Joe Kernan from CNBC, one of their shows, and it just became glaringly obvious to me that he really didn't grasp the nature of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies at all. And the conversation that particular conversation revolved around the consensus mechanisms that these cryptocurrencies use, proof of work and proof of stake. And in that particular interview, he completely mischaracterized the nature of the two, and it became obvious to me that he didn't understand what these things, how they work, or why these different
Yeah.
consensus
Well,
mechanisms work the way they do, and that seemed very fishy to me.
Well, you know what's really crazy too, though, is that it's not just him. Like, yeah, the person that was in charge of the Alameda side of things, Caroline Ellison, who is allegedly like his SBF's ex or current or something girlfriend, some sort of romantic partner. There's videos of her that have resurfaced where she is also like she doesn't know what to say when asked basic questions about the industry that she's, her company's supposed to be like one of the market leaders of, just totally clueless about loads of stuff. And then another top executive at FTX, I guess Ryan Salame, or I'm not sure how you say his last name, but there was also a video that surfaced of him from before the collapse, and he's asked about like trading and crypto and stuff, and he's like, "Oh, I can't talk about that." I mean, they're very evasive about answering really basic questions of stuff you think they would be knowledgeable about. Um, for being, such a visible face of the crypto industry, right? And to go back to something that hints at a bigger network that was I don't think we quite touched on, is that when these guys are around, sort of the hype around them, there was this huge marketing campaign that was paid for by some means that involved like very big name people like Tom Brady and Giselle Bundchen, the guy from what's his name, Larry David, the actor. They had like a Super Bowl commercial. They got their name on the Miami Heat arena, and then that conference where SBF is up speaking with Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. That was a crypto conference in the Bahamas that was backed and organized by FTX. I mean, they've been doing a lot of organizing in terms of PR, but like very flashy and expensive PR, and like creating these conferences, but they have no, if you listen to them, and what you brought up, Marty, too, is that they have no like actual knowledge when pressed on this stuff. I mean, that's pretty nuts. And if people like you could see this, and I think there were some other people that were also calling them out well before the collapse as well. I mean, if these people could see it, why couldn't, the regulators?
And also, here's another thing that I think needs to be explored further, is with all of these campaigns, it's still not clear how they were paid for. In other words, did Larry David accept FTT? Did Tom Brady and Giselle accept FTT? Was it all paid for in FTT? Can you actually sponsor an arena with FTT tokens? I think that seems unlikely, right?
Probably not.
For sure. Some of it probably was, right? But the rest of it, I just don't see a sports team taking FTT tokens for, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And so then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, it really does seem like this entity had an unlimited budget. And if they're not paying for it with FTT, and FTT was the only thing that was really collateralizing this entire Ponzi scheme, well, where was that unlimited budget coming from? Was it just customer funds? Was it something else? Clearly, in the beginning, it was something else. Okay, this money was coming from somewhere. And again, to go from zero to the extent of let's say, market share that they eventually had at their peak, that's not, that takes, as we discussed, money. It takes money. It takes capital. And it's still not clear to me where that's from. And again, just donating, even though they donated a lot to politicians, it's not enough to do, to sort of have the rise that they had. It felt like they were meant to be, in this, not in a universal sense, but in a sort of sketchy sense.
Yeah, definitely sketchy. Well, there's a couple things that have sort of arisen relatively recently on the front of potential collusion with government authorities and regulators. There, for example, is the donations that SBF made not just to the Democratic Party but also to members of Congress that sit on the Financial Services Committee, including Maxine Waters and another congressman. And those two congressmen or congresspeople, I don't know, are the ones that are due to investigate FTX on behalf of the government, which is pretty insane because there's pictures that have resurfaced and videos of Maxine Waters blowing Sam Bankman-Fried a kiss, and they're very chummy and huggy in a lot of these photos. So, that's convenient to have the people investigating you like you that much. And then on the other side of this, there's this apparent connection to Gary Gensler, who's head of the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission.
Yes, it has come to light that there was a particular meeting, I believe earlier this year, between Gary Gensler and SBF, and the meeting notes, the highlight of the topic of the meeting was something like figuring out a way to give FTX amnesty for breaking securities law, with a certain form of legislation that would get pushed through.
And do we know the conclusions of that meeting or what came of it, or that's up in the air?
It's up in the air right now, but we do know that they certainly met, and the nature of the conversation is public. What exactly was said is not.
And of course, I mean, at this point, maybe it makes sense to just throw out some of those connections that I think everyone's heard by now, but makes sense to mention here, I believe, which would be that, Alameda, one of the key figures in the Alameda collapse, Caroline Ellison. Interestingly enough, she went to Stanford, where Sam Bankman-Fried's both of his parents are law professors at Stanford. So that's where she went. And then Sam Bankman-Fried went to MIT, where Caroline Ellison's father is, I believe, the chair of the economics department at
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, Gary Gensler was at MIT for a period of time, involved with, I believe, that MIT's, is it Digital Currency Initiative or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a strange, very incestuous, um, some family connections there. And of course, there comes up Gary Gensler. And then, as Marty mentioned, that they were working on some sort of a carve out, it seems, for FTX. It's certainly worth noting, and people can come to their own conclusions about that, but it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, and then we have the situation where this legislation, I guguess it's in the Senate right now. I'm not really sure which house of Congress is dealing with it, but it was a bill related to regulation of the crypto industry. And SBF was very involved in drafting it. And despite everything that's exploded around FTX and this guy's reputation over the past couple of weeks, just a few days ago, they announced they're still going to roll with it. They're not going to make major changes. They're not going to scrap it. They're going to, roll ahead with a bill that was partially written by a guy behind a massive Ponzi scheme to regulate the industry in which he conducted his Ponzi scheme. It seems a little odd.
Right, and then you've seen, of course, we've all seen the mainstream media articles and headlines trying to sort of say, I mean, the narrative that's coalescing around this post, exposure of this Ponzi fraud is, oh, you know what, this guy still was JP Morgan. I think that was actually a headline. Like,
that was Jim Cramer, wasn't it?
Calling him JP Morgan. Cramer originally called him the modern day JP Morgan, right? Which,
that's so nuts.
Oh yeah, but what I'm saying is that then there was an article. There was an article in the New York Times that said, despite what happened, I'm saying after he blew up, he's still like a JP Morgan. So it's very bizarre. And this is where I have conflicting thoughts on this one. I don't know if Marty would want to expand and sort of his views, is he's more in the weeds of this industry than I am. But I go back and forth with, he was like this nuclear bomb that was meant to detonate inside of this industry and sort of cause so much damage that they could do whatever they wanted with regulation, sort of like the equivalent of 9/11 in this industry. But then on the flip side, it feels to me like the plug was pulled early. That this whole thing wasn't supposed to go down just yet, and so it blew up on a timeline that I guess perhaps his handlers or others were not quite ready for, and that's how they're sort of responding, right? So I don't know. I'm very conflicted on that view. I definitely think this was this entire thing was created intentionally for some major purpose, but I'm just not. I'm not clear in my own head as to whether he was supposed to blow up now or later. Do you have any thoughts on that, Marty?
I think the fraud was definitely uncovered way earlier than they expected. It just seeing how quickly it all unraveled, and like you mentioned, the scramble to tighten up the narrative from the media's perspective immediately after does seem a bit fishy. And I do believe that they were not ready for this fraud to be unraveled at this particular point in time. and yeah, in the con and to speak to SBF and FTX being assets of the state or some um, some group that had an agenda. I certainly think that is the case too, because when you add up all the inconsistencies around Alameda and FTX's history, and again, you mentioned it earlier, Michael, but just the marketing budget alone, the fact that they were able to buy the naming rights to 2 stadiums, to have Super Bowl commercials, to have the FTX patch on the MLB Empire's uniforms throughout the season. They were sponsoring F1 as well and had a large billboard campaign. It never really made sense to me that they had the marketing budget that they did. And like you mentioned, Michael, it seemed like via that marketing budget, the powers that be, whoever they are behind Alameda and FTX, were trying to imbue a sense of legitimacy that simply wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like pure hype at this point, what they were attempting to, get people hooked on. I don't know. I mean, it's just a totally insane story. So, in terms of motives for collusion there between FTX and the state or the people ultimately backing this enterprise, do you think crypto regulation, like forcing that through was meant to be the main motive from the off, or do we see any other sort of reasons behind the promotion of FTX and SBF at this particular time aside from that?
Yes, I mean, I think that's something Bitcoiners have been preparing for some time, and it seems that SBF and FTX were the chosen vessel to bring about uh, what we've been warning about, which is overbearing regulation that would make it significantly harder for individuals to use Bitcoin um, the way it was meant to be used in a peer-to-peer fashion. And it seemed like SBF and FTX were lobbying particularly for stringent control around how individuals interact with cryptocurrencies. And what he was pushing for is that if people are using these things, they should be using them via highly regulated entities like FTX, and not more free market options.
Yeah, and I think also for a long time we've been aware, people that are in the Bitcoin world, that one of the most effective attack vectors for undermining, let's say, Bitcoin is the narrative, the big narrative, the narrative push. And clearly, FTX, as I said earlier, he was like a lab created, entity that would eventually morph the cryptocurrency industry into more of like a CBDC, the fiat world,
Yeah.
sort of a thing. So that to me, and also let's not forget that one of his big things was climate change, right? Now, it could, because he's this, supposedly this like incredibly selfless guy who just wants to make the world better.
Yeah, we'll get into that later.
Right, but that right there, it's a clever way to put the seed into Bitcoin is a problem, because
Yeah.
they'll go into the whole mining stuff, and that's been an attack vector for a long time, and it's certainly ramping up now. And so he was like a perfect kind of guy to be in there, wildly successful, one of the biggest exchanges. He's connected with everyone. Oh, look how he cares about, he cares about saving the world. And if this wonderful messiah of crypto, points out how bad and evil Bitcoin is in particular, that can go a long way into infecting the minds of, let's just say the average person, and especially regulators. So I definitely think that was part of what was going on here for sure.
Yeah, so I think one angle that I haven't seen talked about very much, but I think is very telling to the overall purpose behind this op of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried is related to his desire. I forget where I read this. It might have been that deleted Sequoia Capital article. He talked about in some past interview his desire to have FTX become the everything app. And to me, that's a very telling term, right? Because we've also heard Elon Musk, right, when he bought Twitter, talk about turning Twitter into the everything app, modeling it after WeChat. And so in China, WeChat, right, is the most dominant app. You use it for everything. It's, it's social media, but it's also tied up with your finances. It's tied up with all different aspects of your life, not unlike the digital ID system that's being piloted in different areas of the West right now, and is part of this broader, control grid of which the central bank digital currency, or CBDC, is planned to be part. And that's why I think it's interesting. Use SBF, right? He in FTX, they're having like this crypto conference down where they're based in the Bahamas, and they have someone like Tony Blair come down, who's a huge proponent of this system going back decades, and is currently, through his NGL, I forget what it's called, like the Blair Institute for Global Change or some crap like that, has been pushing really hard for digital IDs more than ever. And so, the Everything app is definitely, the model that a lot of, the people pushing this type of technocratic agenda are looking to sort of segue, it uses a segue for people into this particular control system. Oh, look how convenient this app is, and sort of sell it that way. And he seemed to have had the backing to be the Everything app. And as we'll talk about later, even Elon Musk has some sort of weird intersections with the movement behind SBF, this effective altruist movement, to varying degrees. And it's just, I think that's sort of pretty telling, if true, that, not, it is true that SBF said that that was his ambition for FTX, to have it be the Everything app, but he had a lot of prominent, venture capital funds and other very powerful people, the DNC even, I guess, very much behind him, or he was at least heavily cultivating him, very much positioning FTX to become that dominant Everything app and sort of usher in this new paradigm of money, as they're trying to get the CBDCs off the ground.
Yeah, I just to quickly add to that, I do think again it feels without a doubt that SBF and FTX were meant to be some sort of a bridge, and that's why I think Marty said that they blew up sooner than they were supposed to.
Yeah.
He seems like that was not, you know what I mean. They hadn't finished that yet. There was more to be done to transition maybe the world, into a new way of thinking with new
Yeah.
regulations, and trap them. And that's where the FTX budget came into effect again. Like, how did it grow that fast?
Yeah. So this kind of makes me wonder too, if, maybe the people that helped pull the plug on SBF and FTX, they themselves wanted to be the Everything app, right? And so they're sort of like infighting over who gets to like control that. Because obviously, if you get to be the person that runs and gets all the data from that, like you're really securing your position. Um, in the future, if this, technocracy really takes off and takes hold, which, of course we hope it does not, but these people are planning, for it, obviously. So if you can be the person in charge of that, app, that's like ultimate power in this type of society, into which we're being ushered in. So it would make sense to me to have different factions trying to duke it out for who's going to get to be the, um, you know have that power and have that data over people's lives.
Yeah, and it could even be this, some elements of the state itself, in the sense that they
Yeah.
could come in and say, well, see, yeah, we still need an Everything app, but we can't have these rogue, crazy, capitalists do it. We need to, it needs to be government run.
Or the
So
UN.
yeah,
Or something like
exactly.
that,
Like
yeah.
they're not giving up on, this agenda. It's if anything more like, oh well, he just didn't, it hasn't been tried. It hasn't been done properly.
Yeah, but every time these days I hear someone talk about the Everything app, I definitely, like, pay attention, because that's the part of where this agenda is going. I think that's how they're gonna try to get people hooked on it. And maybe they were gonna do here was try and promote FTX, create this Everything app, get a bunch of people on it, and then, as other economic stuff unravels, and it's easier to blame that,
Mhm.
for the fraud that was already going on in FTX that was exposed early. Right? And then sort of be like, "Oh, well, how convenient. We have all this infrastructure here, and we can just replace, our crappy FTT token with, I don't know, the digital dollar or USDC or something like that, you know?"
It's really interesting that we're talking about this Everything app, and the FTX blow up happened, and then only a few days after the blow up happened, the Fed announces that they're piloting a digital dollar campaign with a bunch of the banks here in the United
Yeah.
States. So maybe that's an opportunity to say, hey, this crazy kid in the Bahamas can't run this app. Maybe the Federal Reserve and our consortium of banks needs to.
Did you see? I just want, we can go into this more later, but there were messages released between McCaskill and Elon Musk where he was trying to
Hmm.
push SBF into being going in with Musk to buy Twitter. So that's very interesting as well. That was,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I think
that's
we'll
the,
be getting
yeah, exactly. We'll
to
get to
the
that later.
effective altruist and EA pretty soon here. But I think before we do that, we've brought up a couple of times these narratives being pushed about SBF both before and after the collapse, and we've already talked about a bit what it seems like he was possibly being groomed for, and some of the other things here. We talked about the climate connection. Um, but we also, so first off, I want to talk about just briefly some of the insane narratives that are coming about mainstream media, not just about Sam Bankman-Fried, but also like Caroline Ellison and some of the other big names here, because I mean they're pretty insane. And I also, after that, want to talk about some of, just briefly, some of his family connections, his parents and his brother. Before we get into effective altruism and William McCaskill. So to start off on that, I would definitely like to point out that Forbes had this insane article about Caroline Ellison, who, again, we've mentioned a few times, was in charge of this um, an Alameda side of FTX, the trading firm, and didn't know very much about trading at all. And when asked if, she could, her advice about like bad trades or anything like that, she couldn't like recall details of any relevant trade she'd ever made that fit like I don't know. I mean, it's really crazy. A lot of these clips are going, around Twitter and in social media right now. But this Forbes article framed her as, among other things, a darling of the alt-right. Is the narrative being out supposedly because like some Curtis Yarvin followers have created a cult about her called like Queen. They call her Queen Carolyn. And this is the type of stuff that they're trying to focus on instead of like the obvious fraud and some of the other connections, like her father's apparent connection that you guys mentioned earlier to Gary Gensler, among other things. And then you have the New York Times covering this, and they're talking about Sam Bankman-Fried. They don't mention fraud at all. They're basically like, oh, these are millennial kids that were just totally out of their depth. And the more evidence that comes out, especially from the guy who's in charge of FTX now and trying to clean up the mess, it's like, it definitely seems like that cannot possibly have been. So why is mainstream media rolling with this narrative that's just so divorced from reality?
Yeah, the alt-right article that Forbes wrote, if you actually like dig into the roots of that narrative, the author of that article DM'd somebody who was associated with Urbit, which is the project that Curtis Yarvin started and has since left. But it's pretty obvious that the individual was trolling her. Like, hey, yeah, we call her Queen Caroline here, and she took that and ran with it in the Forbes article. But again, it's all in an attempt to distract from the overt fraud and uh, the weird connections
It's
with
been
people in
happening a
power.
lot, though, just in the past few days, like a big playing up of sort of these salacious bits that have popped up with the story. It's very much what was done with Jeffrey Epstein, right? Just focus on the salacious bits that grab people's attention and ignore like a lot of the actual crimes that aren't being prosecuted at all, you know?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I don't know. Like Bernie Madoff, when he got exposed for fraud, wasn't he like arrested immediately? And
Hmm.
you know, Sam Bankman-Fried, Caroline Ellison, Ryan Salomon, all these other guys, nothing's happened to them. They're just, let's wait and see.
Right, which again goes back to this overwhelming feeling that, this entity and what it was supposed to achieve, it got cut short in some way that's bothersome to people that essentially have the ability to frame the mainstream narrative. One thing that is very interesting that you pointed out about Caroline, to the point that, is she acting when she just acts this clueless? And it doesn't seem like she is. It seems like she's that clueless. Um, but if you really think about it, if this whole thing was never meant to be a serious exchange, it was meant for something else, then it sort of makes sense to have someone like Caroline there, because she's never gonna, she's never gonna realize how messed up things are, or even that she's potentially being used. She's someone that actually knows what they're doing or has experience is going to go in there and in 2 seconds just be like, "What? I'm out of here." So she was actually in some ways perfect for her position. She thought she was a special and super smart and destined to be this queen of trading. And I think that in itself maybe allowed this to go on a little bit longer. The fact that she actually just had no idea what was going on or where the money was coming from or anything, but sort of enjoyed the ride. That's what it seems like to me.
I think it is important to note too that Caroline wasn't always the CEO of Alameda. There's a gentleman by the name of Sam Trabucco who was the CEO until earlier this year, and he left, leaving her in charge. They might have been co-CEOs, but there was another individual who was CEO of Alameda, or at least co-CEO, for the for the for like a large amount of time since Alameda was launched, and that's Sam Trabucco.
Right. And a few people, I believe, not just him, but I think there were several people that sort of got out of Alameda, and FTX as well, like a
Mm-hmm.
few months before, so sort of like
Yeah.
right before. So that probably is worthy of some more investigation from people as well. And I think
Yeah,
Trabucco was in
definitely.
that camp. Like he left like shortly before it all blew up.
Yeah. So, so to end this bit of it, so post collapse, it's pretty obvious that the mainstream media is sort of stepping in to manage the reputation of SBF. And this is weird to me because like when Epstein got outed, and comparing like the similarities there was agreement across the board that he's a bad guy and a criminal, right? And it was just like, they're covering up the fact that he had a lot of supporters and a support network. But with SBF, they're just being like, oh, forgive him for he was too young to know what he was doing. There's nothing about like he was a brazen criminal and blah blah blah, and let's all distance ourselves from him now. It's a very different strategy. And so I mean, I don't know, it makes you think maybe we should look at his family a little more. I guess maybe, there's some other connection there that might be helping him at this point with mainstream media or even beyond that. I mean, it's really hard to know, but it's definitely bizarre that they're covering for him this extensively because it is, pretty extensive.
Should we just mention? I don't know if you're planning on doing it later, but mention his parents real quick and sort of.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go
Yeah,
for it.
so so on his side, right? There's this is well known, but we should put it here. His mother, Barbara Fried, um, is a Stanford professor, as is his dad, Joseph Fried. Both Stanford professors. She is part of an organization called Mind the Gap, which is concerned with raising money from Silicon Valley wealthy people to Democrats. So there's that. And his dad is an interesting figure that I haven't looked into too much, but the reason I want to mention him is because he seems like he had some like serious involvement with FTX. Like he wasn't just this I'm the father of
He
SBF.
did.
Yeah, he was involved.
Hmm.
So, you've got this Stanford law professor father who also was involved with tax legislation in the United States. I believe one of
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren's proposed tax bills, she actually celebrated the endorsement of Joseph Bankman of the legislation. So that's this is a real figure out here. And again, he's been seen in the Bahamas with SBF, and I don't know if it's regulators or other these celebrities, but he was also reportedly to be there now as they're winding it down, the dad. So
Yeah.
there's something there.
So he's an expert on tax policy and securities, which according to the SEC, pretty much all the crypto that was being traded by FTX, they classify as a security, except for Bitcoin, I guess, which Gary Gensler said they're going to view as a commodity. But if you look at his CV on Stanford, it has like selected publications, a lot of focus on tax shelters. So I'll just read off a couple that are here. Modeling the tax shelter world, substitutes for insider trading. Um, in academics' view of the tax shelter battle, has California broken the tax shelter legislative logjam? These are some of the things that he has written about relatively recently. according to his CV. Just worth pointing that out because Bahamas, the Caribbean in general, tend to be used very extensively in the offshore banking system.
Yep. And then, of course, his aunt as well, Linda Freed. She is I think she's the head of a health department at a university, but she's also part of the WEF. Not just a picture on the WEF, but she's like formally involved with the WEF. So
Yeah, she's in charge of I think the Council
aging.
on Aging
Yeah,
or something like that. Yeah.
that's right.
Mhm.
So, again, I mean, this guy is he's just hooked up all over the place. And that's just this one guy. So,
Yeah. So there's also his brother, and we might get to him here in a second when we talk about the effective altruist movement because of the pandemic funding stuff.
guarding against pandemics. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, and I think he worked for Chuck Schumer as well, if I'm not mistaken, if that's the senator that his brother was working for at one point. Yeah. Anyway, so I think now it's probably time to get into something I think all of us are really interested in exploring on this podcast, which is the people that are effectively behind SBF, which is this effective altruist movement, which is ostensibly led by William McCaskill. But if you look around, there's really supposed to be three, creators or co-founders of this movement. So there's William McCaskill, there's a guy named Toby Ord, and then there's an Australian guy named Peter Singer. So I guess maybe we should start off and say what the effective altruist idea ethos is supposed to be, and how William McCaskill, the face of it that's put out everywhere, because Toby Ord and Peter Singer aren't as much the face of this movement as McCaskill is. Um, should talk about a little bit about how it's quite apparent if you look at his activities in relation to SBF, that he recruited SBF out of undergrad at MIT and basically guided his whole career, including through FTX, and then had a role at FTX as well. So let's get into it.
Okay, I'll start here. This is the area that I've been focused on the most because when I sort of asked myself two questions, so where do all roads lead back to? Number one, and what is the aspect of the story that the media is focusing the least on? It comes to effective altruism, or EA, which I'll try to summarize as good as well as possible. I have tons of thoughts on this, but essentially, if the social credit score world had a philosophy, it would be effective altruism, essentially. In a nutshell, it's concerned with, at least ostensibly, doing the most good for the most amount of people. But in practice, I think where this sort of forks from just all sorts of different philosophies that have been around forever is that this network or this organization is obsessed with a technocratic approach to it. So in other words, it's almost as if you wanted to take the idea of doing good or being an ethical person and then turn it into a hard science. And that's where it gets very dangerous, because what these people claim is essentially that by using technology and research, you can determine what the most good is in the world. And so it starts off on an individual level. It sounds fine, right? It starts off with, if I don't have this beer tonight and I can, put that $5 toward, mosquito nets in Africa, that's a moral choice. I should make that choice every time, which is fine, right? I mean, if you want to make that decision on an individual basis, that's fine. But very quickly, it devolves into which life is worth more than another. Is it worth letting one life go in your neighborhood to save five on another continent? And by the way, they claim and they think that you can have a hard science around this, that you can essentially figure out using a computer and data what the right choice for everyone is at any
Yeah,
given
and
moment.
who's worth more? Who gets to live and who gets to die ultimately is what it sort of boils down to.
Oh, and
And just to interrupt you really
yeah.
quickly, Peter Singer, who's William McCaskill's mentor, and one of the founding guys here, was very controversial, I think, in the early 90s in the US because he argued in favor of infanticide, that it was okay to kill a baby as long as it was like under a month old. Based on his metrics about like what constitutes a human, which was all based around preferences. So if a baby doesn't show preferences, you can just kill it,
Yeah,
basically.
and what happens too is it's interesting. It just goes to show how completely absurd this philosophy gets when
Yeah.
you go beyond a couple of steps from the individual. How absurd it gets. You have some factions of EA that argue that life in the developing world is worth more than a life in the developed world, and then you have another faction that's saying no, you actually need to, a life in the developed world is worth much more than the developing world. So again, this goes right back to um, the idea that a technocratic group using technology will be able to command the ethical choices of everybody, or should be able to. And when you think about it, this is absolutely right. The end goal for the WEF, for all of these like nefarious characters, the direction they're trying to push us in, right? Because historically, if you look at sort of how we think about human behavior, we think of there's certain things you really shouldn't do, like thou shall not kill, things like that. And as long as you avoid those things, you're free to kind of live your life. This effective altruism philosophy is the almost the exact opposite. It's all about telling people what they need to do as opposed to do what they can't do. So again, back to this is why it's so dangerous, because if this gets foothold in the halls of power, which clearly is the intent, it's there's no step from that to the social credit system. If people are convinced that a social credit system can spit out, what you need to do, then you need to do that. And if you don't, you're a bad person because the computer said so.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of issues with it, to say the very least. But it's increasingly looking like, at least in the case of SBF, who was poster child for it, in terms of like, look at this guy that was originally an effective altruist and made this pact to get ultra rich and then give away a bunch of his money for quote unquote good. But a lot of that movement and earlier iterations in the quote unquote philanthropic world, there's been this effort to um, claim that impact investing and philanthropy are analogous, or that altruism is impact investing, and like blurring the lines between what those mean, basically. So, a lot of, this supposedly altruistic behavior, once you have a bunch of money, it's basically, um, it's not exactly altruism as most people would care to define it, or I
Yeah,
think the average person would define it, or even the term philanthropy. It's not really that, but it was definitely built up a lot in the case of SBF. And you have this now deleted Sequoia Capital article. It's totally insane. You have this guy interviewing SBF. SBF isn't even paying attention to him, really, because he's playing a video game and not even looking at the guy while the guy's interviewing him. And then the journalist is just fawning over him. And then a few lines after, describing how this guy just like doesn't even bother to like look him in the eye, starts praising him and being like, I really think he is as selfless as everyone claims. I can't shake this feeling that he's just the selfless Christ figure. And then now SBF, apparently, I think in this Vox article or this recent interview post collapse, has basically said, yeah, I was kind of faking a lot of this altruism stuff. So the
yeah.
question is, how many of these other people are faking the altruism stuff, and what else is going on in this
Well,
movement?
well, considering the connections that that particular Vox journalist has with the EA movement, and
Yeah, is part of
um,
it.
the tenor of that article, there's some people that believe that that was like an overt attempt to have SBF distance himself from the EA movement, to make them look a little better, to seem like this was just one bad apple that really didn't believe it. But I think, on in the overarching discussion about effective altruism, I think it is really important to hone in on this particular detail of effective altruism, which is essentially an extension of utilitarianism, which Peter Singer is the founder of that philosophical belief or school of thought. Uh, I think the iteration of effective altruism really focuses on uh, accumulating as much wealth as possible to dedicate to these causes that they deem worthy, over others. So I think that's the iteration on utilitarianism that effective altruism brings. Again, you mentioned it, the impact investing, Whitney, is these people want to get as rich as possible, and use a lion's share of their funds to bring about what they deem to be the most virtuous uh, on the planet. And that again is very elitist, very technocratic, and I believe that is how McCaskill positions effective altruism. Is like, hey, we believe that the planet is going to have 8 trillion people at some point in the future, and so we have to think of those 8 trillion future humans, and to make them as comfortable and well off as possible, we may need to make some sacrifices today with the people living on the planet right now.
Yeah, so let's talk about McCaskill for a second and how he views altruism. So I guess before we get into McCaskill specifically, it's worth pointing out that if you look at a lot of these organizations in the EA movement, if you like look at their finances and who they're making grants to, ostensibly altruistic grants, there's a lot of money passing around between all these different groups, either tied to McCaskill or tied to people that are part of the close knit power structure of this movement. They're making grants to one, and then that one's making grants back to the people that gave the grant to them, and it's like a very circular movement of money, which is for a lot of other people would look sort of like not so much like altruism, but more like you're moving money around within your own movement. That's a good way to cover up money laundering, which is
Yeah.
something FTX has been accused of enabling. Um, yeah, anything you guys want to say on that front before we get into McCaskill himself and who he is?
I mean, as it pertains to FTX, it seems like they had a very similar model, because they had 134 shell companies as well, and to essentially disguise the movement of funds from FTX Alameda and their other associated subsidiaries.
Yeah, and in the Vox article you mentioned, Whitney, which was written by another EA adherent. He was Dylan Matthews, and it's in fact sponsored by Future Perfect, which is a project within Vox that is specifically effective altruistic. It's super weird. He actually throws out some figures as far as the money at the disposal of this network, and it's anywhere from 26 to 40 something billion. And this isn't just stuff, money that's sitting in like EA bank accounts, but what he's doing is he's taking some of the high profile figures that are publicly associated with this network, and taking their net worths into account, which is probably fair, because a lot of these people are claiming that they're going to give away most of their money. Um,
Yeah.
I'm chomping at the bit to go off on sort of McCaskill and how he how he
Yeah, go
groomed
for it.
SBF. If you don't, if
Tell
you
us
don't
tell us
mind.
who William McCaskill is, or at least his cover story, I guess, and his relationship with SBF.
Yeah, I think if anything that I want to get across on my end on this podcast is William McCaskill, or his birth name apparently it was William Crouch, and he took the name McCaskill from his ex-wife or something. It's bizarre to
His
begin with.
ex-wife's grandmother.
Oh, ex-wife's grandmother, right? So his surname now is actually his ex-wife's grandmother's name, not even his original name. So that's interesting to begin with. But this is a guy who, the more you look into him, the more there's clearly stuff there that we don't know. So SBF was this physics major at MIT, and he hadn't even graduated when, in I believe 2013, it was right around there, William McCaskill was at MIT giving a talk, and was introduced to SBF somehow. And in that introduction, McCaskill immediately apparently was enthralled by this guy and picked him out specifically as an individual to, I mean, there's no other way to put it, to groom. He then, this is, by the way, all of this is coming from that deleted Sequoia article, so I'm not inventing any of this. This is
Well, it's
exactly.
also in the New Yorker piece on McCaskill and effective altruism.
Yes, yes. So McCaskill, essentially plucks this guy out of MIT, hasn't even graduated, and in the conversations with SBF, apparently convinced SBF that the best thing SBF could do for the world is to make as much money as possible, and then fund EA causes. And then the interesting thing is, SBF hadn't even interned at Jane Street Capital yet, but McCaskill is the one that suggested Jane Street. hedge fund, the New York hedge fund, where a lot of
Mm-hmm.
these, Alameda FTX people interned for a period of
And
time.
a lot of them, a lot of
Yes.
the FTX and Alameda people have overlapping ties to Jane Street and effective altruism. The majority, it turns out, have overlaps with both. So that's pretty interesting. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, Caroline, of course, was at Jane Street for a period. That's where she met FBF, and also Gabe Bankman-Fried, Sam's brother, I believe, also worked at Jane Street for a short period of time. So that's weird. Okay, so I worked on Wall Street, right? I mean, I was very deep in the hedge fund industry and all that stuff. I didn't work at the hedge fund industry, but they were clients. And for a PhD philosophy professor, young, at Oxford, to for the first thought in his mind upon meeting this guy at MIT, Sam Bankman-Fried, oh, you need to work at Jane Street. That to me was one of the biggest red flags I've seen, because that's a very bizarre connection.
The physics major. Yeah.
Right, he was a SPF was a physics major. That's a very bizarre connection. So first of all, not only does McCaskill pick this guy out of the crowd at MIT, he then convinces him that he needs to make as much money as possible. And then he suggests, hey, you should go intern at Jane Street. So weird. I cannot come up with a normal explanation for that sequence.
Yeah, there definitely isn't. And I think even after that, let's point out too that while SBF is at Jane Street, the McCaskill connection continues. And he's involved, I think, also in guiding SBF after he leaves Jane Street as well, which leads to the creation of Alameda and FTX.
Right. So on this front, again, EA, effective altruism, and William McCaskill are all over the entire origin story of FBF, like at least the one we know of. So SBF works at Jane Street for a period of time and then leaves, and then he moves back out to San Francisco. He was born in that area. And at this point, he doesn't have a job. And McCaskill offers, and this is from the Sequoia article, McCaskill offers him a job at the Center for Effective Altruism at that point. Now, it's not clear whether SBF took that or not, but it was offered to him. So there's McCaskill again in San Francisco offering this guy a job. Shortly after that is when the whole arbitrage trade supposedly happened. And interestingly enough, as we discussed earlier, this was an arb trade that was I guess the arbitrage opportunity was well known, right? That the price of Bitcoin was trading at a significant premium in Korea and Japan, and nobody really was able to make a lot of money out of it because you needed bank accounts, in various jurisdictions. You need to be able to move money around, right? Something that you need to be connected, essentially very connected, to pull off. And the person apparently was a grad student in Japan who helped make this trade happen for SBF, was also in the EA, Effective Altruist Network. So SBF was somehow connected to another EA in Japan who
let him use the bank account.
Exactly, who let him use the bank account. So again, who even put SBF in touch with this guy to know about the arb trade? I suspect that again, like some hand back there in that network tipped off SBF and said, hey, by the way, there's this big trade. Oh, by the way, this guy can help you with bank accounts in Japan. It's all weird. And then when SBF wants to raise more money to apparently continue to exploit the ARB or for other reasons, he taps the EA network once again. And this guy, John Tallinn, who is a co-founder of Skype, apparently puts together, either it was all his own money or a group of EA money, $50 million to give to SBF. And supposedly from that, right, initial injection and the ARB trade, FTX is born. And I would like to point out that even in the Sequoia article, I think it was Nishad Singh, he explicitly states that none of it could have happened without EA. None of it. So, objectively, the Effective Altruism Network, a supposedly some sort of philosophy from Oxford, is able to create Alameda and FTX. The entire origin story, every single piece of it, leads back to William McCaskill and EA. every single piece.
I think even the part where SBF decides to leave Jane Street, per the Sequoia article, it's because of a moral dilemma he has because of his EA philosophy, which now he's told these Vox people was bunk, that he doesn't actually care about that philosophy. It was just like a front,
Right,
right?
because he wasn't making enough at Jane, so he needed to make more to save the world. Which, by the way, I want to point out, and I think everyone should Google this and look at the pictures associated with it, just to show you how EA itself, I believe, is a front. It's no, I don't think any of the higher ups in this movement believe any of it, because if you read that
Yeah.
New Yorker article, it begins with William McCaskill um, being so frugal that he wouldn't have beers with his friends because he could be saving, the poor kids in Africa, right, with his beer money. And then, fast forward a few years later, and the Center for Effective Altruism has purchased one of the most exquisite and celebrated private residences in all of the UK, called Wytham Abbey, which is outside of Oxford. It's a 1480s, essentially it looks like a castle. And so you go from a guy who claims he won't eat a chicken or have a beer because he could be saving the world, to his center buying a
Being at
castle.
one of the most expensive, private residences in all of Britain. That
Right.
is quite a jump, isn't it?
Right. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this whole thing, and I don't want to disparage, your useful idiot who comes out of college and thinks, wow, this is so good. Like, this is idealistic, right? The rank and file that associate with EA are just, they really are, they believe it. But I'm saying all indications point to the people who are actually, at this point in charge of billions, do not believe any of it, and their deeds show that.
Yeah, one angle of EA I think is interesting is this, the same utilitarian ideology, right? In theory, the ends justify the means, and this is said in other pieces that talk about the EA movement. So in theory, you could justify to yourself running a giant Ponzi scheme and stealing a bunch of people's money because you know how to spend it better than they do for, greatest impact for good, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's sort of part of this philosophy.
this is precisely why it's such a dangerous philosophy, and the fact that has billions, tens of billions at its disposal, and is influencing politics. Remember, SBF funded a lot of his donations were actually, he funded this one person who was running an EA in Oregon in the primary. He was trying to get that person elected, who was an effective altruist. This philosophy very, very clearly can justify anything. And in fact, it does. And one of the areas that I think you've been interested in is the fact that it's shifted over time, of course, to long-termism, is what they call it. EA, that's like the thing that SBF was also very interested in. And as Marty mentioned, this is, it's like mental masturbation to the extreme. They believe not only that, they believe that not helping people that are dying or poor now isn't good enough. They need to save the lives of the future trillions of humans, and they know how to do it, right? And so again, if you feel like you know how to effectively save the lives of trillions of future humans, and you understand that, you can and will justify doing anything at the current moment. And so when you merge this philosophy with what the political and oligarchic elite are obviously trying to do now, it's the perfect fit, because it provides this justification for doing anything in the present to save the trillions in the future. And I would also want to add, because I don't want to forget, that McCaskill was an advisor to FTX. I think it was the fund,
The future fund.
Future fund, yeah.
up until the blow up. I mean, he was right there until the very end. And by the way, I also want to mention this too, because I want people to look into it. This is so bizarre as well. McCaskill, as I mentioned, was texting with Elon Musk about SBF, not the other way around. Okay, so McCaskill knows
He's his
Musk.
handler.
Right,
That's how it looks. Yeah.
He knows him so well that he's texting Elon Musk, just like casual, like, hey, how's your day going? By the way, SBF is a great partner to buy Twitter with you. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's like, can I connect you guys? So this obscure.
Well, didn't Elon Musk also tweet out that about McCaskill's book, that this is basically his philosophy also?
Correct.
Yes,
Yes.
this book aligns most closely with my personal philosophy, I believe is what he said. But
Uh-oh.
but there's another interesting nugget here between Twitter, FTX, EA as well. Uh, One thing that was highlighted in the balance sheet of FTX and Alameda that's been shared in the last few weeks is that part of their balance sheet, one of the assets on their balance sheet, is Twitter stock, and this is private Twitter stock.
Hmm.
So as we know, Elon has bought Twitter and taken it private, and there were only a few shareholders who were able to convert their public shares into private shares, and it seems like FTX may have been one of those shareholders.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it just goes back
Hmm.
to how does a young philosophy professor at Oxford texting Elon Musk, suggesting to Sam Bankman-Fried that he go work at Change Street, helping this network providing all of the initial funding
Yeah.
and right capabilities to make the origin story happen. Just none of it. I mean, as Mark Cahote said, I mean, none of it adds up. And and again, nobody's really focusing on this angle, as far as I can tell.
No, I
It's
think it's a very telling angle because I mean, you look at this William McCaskill guy, he is 100% Sam Bankman-Fried's handler from the time he's an undergrad to now. And that's like a decade of guiding everything this guy does. And this guy's being propped up, like we talked about, groomed for this big role of like crypto savior, one of the big faces in the entire industry who's going to lead people to what we mentioned earlier, the bridge between the current financial system and CBDC. At least that's how it looked. And this is the guy behind him, an Oxford philosophy guy. I don't really buy that. And then, another Elon Musk connection, it's a little more indirect. Um, the building at Oxford that the Center for Effective Altruism has been at for several years, I think, at least before they bought this palatial estate recently, was called the Future for Humanity Institute, which is funded by Elon Musk. So they were sharing the same office space, basically. And this Future for Humanity Institute makes this same argument that's basically an argument for transhumanism, where they say, we have to augment because AI is inevitable and it's going to take over everything. So to compete with this inevitable super AI, we have to become machines ourselves, and, plugs the whole transhumanist stuff. So, just interesting, these networks, are so close together, and a lot of it's at Oxford. And it's worth pointing out too that like the Oxford, has a long-standing tie to British intelligence agencies. Just throw that out there. William McCaskill, is he just a philosophy professor? I don't know, but it doesn't really look like it. And one thing I wanted to mention about him too, in terms of his role at the FTX Future Fund, I think it's the New Yorker article. It basically points out that while he's at FTX, he's basically looking with this future fund. He has a role in moving a lot of the money at that future fund to other organizations that are part of this umbrella or closely tied to the Center for Effective Altruism. And as I was telling you guys before the show, we took a look at some of the financials, at least in the British system, for the Center for Effective Altruism, and something happened in August of this year, where they basically split themselves into 5 different, or maybe 6. So they just splintered off, and divided themselves into much smaller companies. And William McCaskill was using different variations of his name to get different ID numbers tied to each company. So if you click on this guy's name or anyone's name, like at Company's House or something like that, you're going to get, all of the entities they're tied to. So the fact that he used different variations of his name, you click on one and only one person comes up, and then that's the only entity tied to that variation of that name. So instead of William McCaskill, it's William David McCaskill, or Dr. William McCaskill, or Dr. William David McCaskill, like all these different iterations of his name. And then the other thing that is a red flag for me in terms of potential intelligence connections of this guy, he is using, as we mentioned earlier, his ex-wife's grandmother's surname. He's claimed that his surname is Crouch, that his real name is William Crouch. But at least as far as we saw, and it's possible that, maybe he wasn't included in, the UK databases that allow you to see like birth registration and stuff. But William Crouch didn't turn up any results for March 1987, which is the birth month and year that he supplied to the British government with the filings of this stuff. So it's very possible that William Crouch isn't even his actual name. And isn't it weird that he's William McAskill using a last name that's not tied up with his family at all? But he's supplying his former name, but it turns out his former name might not actually be his former name. Okay, so and there's also nothing about his parents from what I've seen. You can't find out much about William McAskill's parents, who presumably have the last name Crouch, if he's to be believed. But it seems like there's a lot of effort to obfuscate his lineage. That is, I mean, there's a lot of red flags around this guy. And, probably an even bigger red flag is that there's no interest from the media in looking into him in this movement at all, despite the fact that he's the handler 100%.
Right, and that's the thing, because a lot of, and this is very important, because the way it's being spun, to the extent that it's being spun at all, is that SBF was some sort of successful guy who then became a convert to effective altruism, when that's completely not what happened. What happened is the Effective Altruism
He was
Network
sought out.
created, yes,
Mhm.
created him. This is all laid out there. I'm not even, he was created by the Effective Altruism Network, specifically William McAskill. And so again, who is this guy? What is going on here? And they even say in the Sequoia article that the 50% of Alameda's original profits were being funneled right back to the Center for Effective Altruism.
Yeah.
So it's all this money is going back and forth, and it'd be very curious to see, where the stolen money ends up, right?
Yeah.
If
And
we will find out. Anything you want to add to that, Marty?
No, I was gonna say, just in the last few weeks too, it seems like there's been a concerted effort to scrub information about William McCaskill from the internet. Uh, one interesting thing that happened to me personally in the last few weeks is, I got onto the tip of effective altruism and William McCaskill being behind it. So I was doing research, trying to find podcast and interviews with him, and one individual who did a podcast episode with him was Lex Friedman. And literally the day that I found the podcast episode, I was able to get access to the episode and the audio file. But as I was listening to it, literally like the hour in which I was listening to it, Lex Friedman pulled the podcast from all his platforms and wiped the tweet, deleted the tweet announcing the podcast episode as well. So it seems like there's
Yeah,
an
and he
effort
blocked
to,
you for calling it out.
yeah, yes.
Yeah, let me just throw one thing out there also, which I think is an interesting nugget that could, be useful to explore further, is the Alameda, right, was co-founded, and almost nobody knows this, but it was co-founded by SBF, right, and a person no one's ever heard of called Tara McAuley.
Mhm.
She was the CEO of the Center for Effective Altruism. Now she moved away from both Alameda and the CEO position there, I think in 2018. But isn't it interesting that Alameda was co-founded by the former CEO of the Center for Effective Altruism? It's just too bizarre to
Yeah.
dismiss.
Yeah,
Okay.
and with Tara specifically too, she went on to start some crypto fund in the UK, Terra something, I believe. But if you go to her Twitter page, until last week, she hadn't tweeted in 4 or 5 years. And then for some reason or another, she decided to come out of Twitter retirement after many years to distance herself from SBF and write a long thread about the fact that she did co-found Alameda, but has since left and does not support SBF.
All right. So I think what we've established here, yeah, William McCaskill is Sam Bankman-Fried's handler and has been for a long time. The Center for Effective Altruism seems to be the force behind FTX, right? So when you're looking at what FTX was doing, trying to become the everything app, being one of the top, SBF being one of the top donors to the DNC, the Democrats, this past cycle, and also the offering of financial services as it relates to crypto donations for Ukraine. You have the Center for Effective Altruism involved in this, apparently. It was setting up the entity that does all of this stuff. So if SBF is a front for these guys, why does the Center for Effective Altruism, why is it trying to curry extensive favor with the DNC? Why is it involved in apparent money laundering in Ukraine? Why is it involved in all of this stuff? And the other angle we haven't talked about yet is a lot of this pandemic stuff. So I think it's important to point out that the EA movement, one of their other biggest stars before SBF, was Dustin Muskovitz, who is a co-founder of Facebook. He's the co-creator of Open Philanthropy. Open Philanthropy was directly incubated by Effective Altruism with involvement, I believe, from William McCaskill as well. But it was like a co-creation of Muskovitz and his philanthropies with this group called Give Well, who were ex hedge fund guys that bought into this philosophy, quote unquote, and created, an entity, some sort of philanthropic, quote unquote, entity. And so that merged with Muskovitz's stuff and creates Open Philanthropy. But it's very much intimately tied to this EA network we're talking about. And those are the people that funded Event 201. Yeah, the coronavirus simulation before COVID-19 happened. And then you have SBF on his side funding some weird pandemic related things, having a weird obsession with pandemics that he describes to McCaskill from the off, or I think it's to McCaskill he describes it, and then funding the study that poo-poos ivermectin and uses a lot of funny statistics and quote unquote science to do so, among other things. Any thoughts there, guys?
My only thought is it's very creepy that
To be obsessed with pandemics.
to be obsessed with pandemics, and not only that, but yeah, the fact that SBF was the main funder of a study that poo-pooed what have come to be known as very reliable early treatments for COVID is a bit perplexing.
Okay, yeah. So just to add a little color on some of the stuff Whitney mentioned. First, yeah, that study with ivermectin that said it doesn't work. It was the Future Fund, FTX Future Fund, that funded that. And as far as I know, I think that study has not released a lot of their data, their underlying data. So that's one of the reasons it's considered sketchy. Some other pandemic stuff that I've noticed that I'll mention is, as we discussed earlier, also EA adherent and former Jane Street employee Gabe Bankman-Fried, Sam's brother, is running an organization called Guarding Against Pandemics, which I believe was completely funded by SBF. So, again, it's not just him, it's his brother who's like really obsessed with, pandemics and pandemic preparedness. This other guy, Salami, who was an FTX employee, pretty high up, I believe, in the organization. He's
He
been
was an executive, yeah.
yeah, he's been propped up by a lot of people trying to say that the donations to the Democrats don't matter because look at this guy Salami giving to the GOP. But when you look into the details of what Salami was funding, he wasn't like giving to Donald Trump or anything. He was giving to primaries, GOP primaries, and when you look deeper, the the primary candidates that he was supporting were the ones that were hyper focused on pandemics. Again, super weird. What is going on? And when you see some interviews with this Salami guy, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's like really worried about like pandemics. So that's bizarre as well. And then I just wanted to note that if you think about the COVID response, right, the philosophical underpinnings to us losing our freedoms during COVID, it again ties in perfectly with effective altruism because in effective altruism, you always have to make a cold, calculated decision on what's best for the most amount of people, right? Like what's the most good you could do. And freedom or civil liberties plays zero role in that, right? That's not part of its ethics. So if you think about some of the things that were done, in particular, let's turn unvaccinated people into second class citizens, or they shouldn't be able to do anything. They should get fired because they won't take an experimental a vaccine or injection. That is exactly what an effective altruist would argue. They would argue that the greatest good is done by vaccinating everybody. So everybody must do it, and if you don't, you're a bad person and need to be punished. So, it actually does make sense in that sense because if you want to create and mold a society in which a few people determine how you should live. Effective altruism provides that bedrock philosophy for that. And so, again, it's this twisted philosophy. It's a philosophy that everyone effectively in power, the oligarchy, the state, the intelligence, agencies, they all want to push humanity into accepting this sort of philosophy. So
Yeah. So a couple things I want to add about the pandemic stuff. So you also have more recently revelations that FTX, or really, I guess it's Sam Bankman-Fried, is funding major media outlets like ProPublica and also The Intercept. And his focus in providing those funds was to have them report more on biosecurity policy, which is a lot of this, and pandemic preparedness, I believe. So we can assume, based on how those outlets covered COVID, what type of coverage that would be and what it would not be, right? And then the other group he funded was the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which most people probably know because they moderated Event 201. But if you're familiar with my work, they used to be the Center for Civilian Biodefense Studies, and these are the people that wrote Dark Winter before the anthrax attacks, that predicted a lot of the aspects of the anthrax attacks and so on. For people that are familiar with my work on that, you can go read the series about it on unlimitedhangout.com. And you know, the other guy that's tied up with this movement. So Peter Singer and William McCaskill are two of the names, and there's a direct like mentor-mentee relationship there. Toby Ord is the other guy that's thrown out as a founder of this movement, and I'm not sure exactly where he fits into with McCaskill and Singer, but he and I think, Mike, you sent this to me. He was talking about how he collaborated with a guy named Jason Matheny. And so Jason Matheny is in this article that I was sent is talking. He's described as the CEO of Rand Corporation, which historically has been one of the spookiest military contractors and research organizations of all in the United States. But Jason Matheny also used to work for the Center for Johns Hopkins for Health Security under the people that wrote the Dark Winter exercise. And he also used to lead IARPA, which is the intelligence community's DARPA equivalent. And he's also on the National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence, which is full of spooks and the top people in Silicon Valley that, the big Silicon Valley firms who double as military and government contractors. And that connection I find really telling about, these aren't just philosophers, to say the very least. So there's definitely a very disturbing network here with a particular agenda, and they have a cover story, which is they're altruistic and they know what's best for everyone better than regular people do, like we've been talking about. And so I think in looking at FTX, you're starting to see into this network that was behind them. I have a feeling they're not just behind FTX, they're probably behind some other stuff. But this particular group that we're starting to see come into focus here, and that we've been talking about over the course of the podcast today, was really angling for a major role in the technocracy to come, or at least that the powers that be hope will come. And I think it's really, this group needs a lot more attention than they are getting, to say the very least. The fact that you have like Muskovitz and Open Philanthropy tied up in here, which is one of the biggest donors to like biosecurity stuff in general, aside from maybe the Wellcome Trust and Gates Foundation. I mean, they're like really up there, not quite at that level, but very close to it when it comes to funding this kind of stuff. There's a lot to be said. And, this whole DNC Ukraine stuff before the midterms and all of that is also just mind-boggling. I don't know if you guys want to talk about any of those aspects before we get to wrapping up here.
Another very odd timing thing is the going back to SBS mother Barbara, and she runs a massive PAC that donates to Democratic candidates, and the timing of FTX launching and a massive donation she made to the Democratic Party is a bit odd. I believe FTX was founded, and then a month later she was able to donate tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I would add, just to put some color on what you were saying, Whitney. So Jason Matheny, who you mentioned, that was Toby Ord's friend at Oxford, or colleague and friend at Oxford.
Yeah.
And he pointed Ord in a particular direction to look at a project called DCP2. So yeah, again, it's interesting that all of a sudden these people, like as you mentioned, he's a spooky guy, is whispering in the ear of Ord at Oxford, you know, so hey, take a look at this, you know. And Ward, of course, is considered one of the founding, you know, intellectual leaders of EA. The other thing is just specifically, so this is from the Vox article, and just to give some details, so it says Open Philanthropy spent over 65 million on these issues, including 7 and 8 figure grants to the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and the Nuclear Threat Initiative's biodefense team. I think
Hmm.
that you had some thoughts on the and NTI as well, I think.
Yeah, they were co-founded by Ted Turner and Sam Nunn, who Sam Nunn is sort of one of the architects of a lot of this biosecurity legislation, and he was he played the president in the Dark Winter anthrax simulation, and has a lot of ties to, the particular network that seems to have been behind the 2001 anthrax attacks, among other things. And people like Margaret Hamburg, for example, who was at Dark Winter too, and pops up, and she was, I think, Obama's FDA commissioner. She was on this panel in 2019 with Fauci where they talk about getting rid of regulations to ram through mRNA vaccines and stuff. She was a big name at NTI for a while as well. I think up until she became FDA commissioner. She might still be there, but they're a big player in biosecurity land, to say the very least. I mean, these are very like intelligence connected organizations, sort of where intelligence bleeds into this big pharma healthcare stuff. Because I mean, if you look at big pharma, right, there's longstanding connections to intelligence in the military. I mean, keep in mind, right, like a great example is Donald Rumsfeld, who went between stints at Secretary of Defense, being a top executive at JD Searle and Co., which produces aspartame, but I think was ostensibly a pharmaceutical company, and then also at Gilead, which is the producer of remdesivir and some of these, and Tamiflu, and some of these other, antivirals that have been made a lot of money off of a lot of these biosecurity scares of the past, including bird flu and, more recently the COVID-19 stuff. So, these are not small time players they're promoting to. And if you're, donating to these organizations because you think they can do the most good, I mean, if you're looking at your track record, what they do is they advance the biosecurity state and technocracy, and they take away our rights and our civil liberties, or at least create policy for that to be done. And as we've talked about, their particular philosophy, when you follow it to the same conclusion these particular effective altruists we're talking about today follow it, you end up in that same end point, right? So I may have misspoken then when I said FTX funded the Johns Hopkins Centers for Health Security. It may have been Open Philanthropy that did that. I'll have to go double check if FTX actually did that. So my mistake there, for not being 100% on that. But they're definitely, this particular network, Effective Altruism, is funding a lot of very interesting things that seem to overlap or really converge around the idea of, scientific dictatorship at the end of the day.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so we're coming up to, close to 2-ish hours or so. So it's probably a good time to, unless there's any other aspect of the case you guys wanted to get into. We didn't talk about Ukraine or some of the allegations there about money being funneled back to the DNC and all that have sort of emerged recently. But we can talk about some of our, conclusions, areas for further research, because a lot of people that listen to this podcast and other podcasts, I presume as well, that are cover similar themes, or eager to look into some of this stuff, because I think even Elon Musk had to say that a lot of the big stories coming, or big revelations about FTX, have been made by quote unquote regular people, non-journalists, on social media and such. So maybe we can go over some of those things.
The Twitter sleuths really pushing things forward here. I
Yeah.
do think we should mention there is another smoking gun that really highlights some potential FTX government corruption,
All right.
which
Yeah.
is
Go
which
for
is
it.
the fact that one of their subsidiaries was able to buy a CFTC regulated clearinghouse. So there's options trading company called Ledger X that FTX US, via one of their subsidiaries, I believe it's called Welshire Realms, was able to
What West
purchase.
Realmshires, I
Yes,
think.
what
Mhm.
West Welmshires was able to purchase Ledger X. And again, to me, that this is a smoking gun, because if you understand the nature of like how hard it is to actually get the license to become a clearinghouse in the first place, it's a bit odd that FTX was able to purchase this clearinghouse, because you think if the CFTC was doing proper due diligence, they would be asking for bank statements and just very fundamental financial statements that would be necessary to get the okay to purchase and operate this regulated clearinghouse. And as we know, FTX didn't even have a bank account when they wound up purchasing this clearinghouse. To me, that signals that there's some potential government involvement in terms of them allowing this massive fraud to continue and to grow to as large as it did.
Yeah, we'll see if that comes up in Maxine Waters' investigation into FTX. What do you think?
I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's mental at this point. It sort of reminds me of like when they tried to put Henry Kissinger in charge of the 9/11 Commission. Like you pick a person with a huge, like obvious conflict of interest in investigating stuff to like lead the investigation. And these types of things, that seems to be like exactly what happened. So, to have the person who's blowing SBF kisses and cuddling up with him for photo ops and got like hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from him. I mean, she's going to investigate him now. All right.
Yeah, I
All
mean,
right.
for me, Whitney, yeah, I'll just sort of conclude with my final thoughts here. First, I just wanted to
Mhm.
thank you for putting this together. I've been in podcast retirement for over a year, and actually had no intention of doing another one, because I'm sort of checked out on that stuff for now. But this, I felt like, was so important and so undercovered in the angles that I felt like needed to be explored, that I was happy to come on, and certainly based on how this
Well,
conversation has
thank
gone.
you.
Thank you. Certainly based on how this conversation has gone, I feel like it's achieved at least certainly the objective that I wanted, which is, to say that this whole thing stinks, without a doubt. I mean, it stinks from the top to the bottom, but I think it stinks so much in so many different tentacle directions that I wanted to focus on what I feel like is the most important direction to focus on, which again goes back to effective altruism, William McCaskill. What is going on there? What is that really? And how does it play a role in the future? Because this is not good. That network is not going to go away. They are fabulously wealthy, clearly super connected, and have a dangerous anti-freedom philosophy that will, if it continues to gain traction amongst the movers and shakers of the world, is an absolute intellectual foundation for social credit score technocracy, as you mentioned. And that is, if anything, other than being a parent and husband, is my number one focus in life, to not have myself or my children and descendants live under such a system. So to me, I'm left with more questions than answers still at this point. However, I feel like the questions that I'm asking, and the directions that I encourage others to investigate, um, are the proper ones to do. And so I hope that, I know you have an audience of people who are super motivated to figure out the workings of the world around us, and have and actually have a free future for humanity. So I hope that we've put enough nuggets out there for others to carry the torch forward from here on out. And just thanks again for having me be a part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess in terms of conclusions, then I think what we've kind of agreed on so far. Looks like FTX was blown up early, but it's still not quite clear for what purpose it was blown up early, but we sort of got an inkling of what FTX's original purpose seems to have been before it was blown up early. So I guess a big question I have at the end of this was, how are the groups that were behind FTX's and SBF's meteoric rise, how have they been affected by this collapse? And it seems like we've been talking about sort of a weak point in the aftermath of this collapse is the sort of exposure of a quote unquote philosophical movement that doesn't make a lot of sense and is a front for something else. So I definitely agree with you, Mike, that this effective altruist movement, William McCaskill and their associates and associated funds, because these guys do move a lot of money and they have a lot of different organizations around, and they'll probably start scrubbing it sooner than later. I mean, if Lex Friedman was willing to take all of his interviews of William McCaskill down and then block Marty Bent for pointing it out. I mean, I don't, there's something they don't want people to look at. And that probably means that's the place to look at. And you have, these tendrils coming out of that movement that involve um, major aspects of COVID stuff. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention that I think is important too, Jane Street, with all this overlap there, with this EA movement and whatnot, they somehow, according to the Financial Times, is one of the few firms that knew how to trade 2020 before COVID was known to most people. And, the debacle of COVID and all the quarantines and all of that, they knew how to trade it in advance. And they made like 1,000% increase. I had like 1,000% increase in profits between 2020 and 2019 because of that. So that's sort of suggestive. The way it's written by the Financial Times is foreknowledge. And so you have the same movement sort of involved in Event 201. It definitely raises some eyebrows, including mine, to say the very least. So I think there is definitely a deeper story here. And I think most people get that. But the question is, what should we focus in on to try and unravel the rest of that deeper story? And I think we've sort of gotten to big chunks of that, at least today. So awesome.
I think there's a potential that SBF has given us a gift, because it seems that there's a potential that he was certainly the front man, but he was a front man that went a bit rogue and got caught up in the competitive nature of the cryptocurrency space and really allowed this fraud to be unraveled sooner than the backers would have liked, because it's become very apparent that much of the or many people on the FTX team were on stimulants, and they weren't acting with the clearest minds, and the extent of the fraud at FTX, literally, it's something we didn't touch on. They were literally taking user deposits and gambling with them. And if they were able to simply not do that, to take their user deposits and burn them with bad trades, there's a likelihood that FTX and Alameda would have been able to survive much longer. And so we might be able to give a hat tip to SBF for going crazy on stimulants and becoming a big risk taker that eventually led to his quick downfall and potentially the downfall, or highlighting that there's something going on with this effective altruism movement, and now the attention is there. So we'll give a hat tip to SBF for that.
So last question then about SBF then before we wrap up. You have a lot of these people that are backed by the establishment involved in financial crime. I sort of talked about a couple of the parallels with Epstein. Epstein's obviously a different case, but you also have like Elizabeth Holmes, right? Theranos, however you say it. And it's basically, she has like Kissinger on the board and all these like deep state, quote unquote, guys on the board. And then was recently, sentenced to like 11 years for fraud and stuff. And there's been no efforts to arrest SBF or anyone else tied up with FTX. What do you guys see happening there? Or do you think he could potentially even be Epsteined?
I think it's extremely odd that he has not been apprehended yet. So that to me signals that he's being protected to some degree, and whether or not he continues to be protected because of all the information he has access to and all the dead bodies that he knows are associated with his company and the movement behind it. I wouldn't be surprised if something happens, but it is really telling that he has not been arrested yet. Like you mentioned earlier, Whitney, Bernie Madoff was arrested immediately. It seems that SBF is being allowed to just putz around the Bahamas without really worrying about being apprehended.
Yeah, well, Jeffrey Epstein in the late 80s executed what was then, I think, the biggest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history at Towers Financial with Steve Hoffenberg, and his name was dropped from the case. And then he goes and starts fundraising for the Clintons, right? So, I mean, there's people that get away with this massive fraud and then they use them again for something else if they're good enough. The question is SBF actually talented at financial gobbledygook in crime, like Epstein was? I'm not so I don't know if that's so true. He and Carolyn Ellison and some of these other people just seem like they were, stand-ins.
Yeah, you know what? It might be a gift to us that he hasn't been arrested, or none of them have, sort of like what Marty alluded to earlier, which I completely agree with. in the sense that every day that they aren't arrested, you just have more people that are, let's say, less conspiratorial minded, or more willing to accept the mainstream narrative of stuff. It'll start tickling their minds even too. Like, what is going on here? There's definitely something else here. So, I mean, everything starts with someone saying to themselves, "Wait a minute, this doesn't add up. There's more stuff here. Let me explore that." That's how it happened for me. I was actually in Arizona with my family on vacation when this whole thing went down. I was trying to ignore news as much as possible, and then just I couldn't ignore it anymore. I just, like, it was so crazy. It was, as I messaged you, Whitney. I said, this is like the craziest rabbit hole I've seen since Epstein. It reminded me of that, and I couldn't look away. So, hopefully, the fact that they haven't been arrested is a great signal to people that, wait a minute, I probably shouldn't look away.
Yeah, great point. Well, hopefully people won't look away and more will come out of it. I don't think it'll come from the mainstream media. I think it'll come from independent media and, Twitter slews and people, with an interest in getting to the bottom of this that aren't tied to the establishment and want to know, why does this fraud get to keep happening to people over and over again and nothing's done about it? At least when they're, have powerful friends. But I think, like we've talked about today, the story is a lot deeper and potentially has ramifications for some of the biggest, events over the past couple years. There's a big Ukraine angle. There's a big, pandemic COVID-19 side to this as well. And then, campaign funny money. Yeah, it's definitely not going to go away. And hopefully, more revelations will come out about some of this network, because it's going to be bigger. As we've already talked about, it is bigger than just FTX and SBF. So with that being said, thanks to everyone for listening. Special thanks, of course, to Mike and Marty for joining me today. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would please encourage you to share this around for other people that might also be interested in this story and can help us, perhaps collectively help us, get closer to the core of what's really going on here. And also a huge thank you, as always, to the supporters of Unlimited Hangout in this podcast. It would not be possible without you. And yeah, that's it for today. Catch you all next time.